Welcome to the Pro Football Focus DFS Chalk Talk podcast. I'm your host, Scott Barrett, joined by DFS legend Tyler Buecher. Tyler, how'd you do last week?
Scott, it's great to be back. Last week was phenomenal for me. It was finally a very profitable week. A lot of the plays that we had discussed here and in both our articles all over the site were the nuts. I mean, to be honest, we had guys. I'm like just looking over my cash game lineup that's available every Friday. It covered Kirk Cousins, Deshaun Watson, Le'Veon Bell, Fournette, Mark Ingram, McKinnon, Antonio Brown, Larry Fitzgerald, Golden Tate, Jarvis, Devontae Adams, Zach Miller, Cameron Brate. These were all like 15 to 20 to 30 plus point plays. It was a pretty good week for me because I stuck to a tight core, bounced around in a lot of single entry tournaments, and the sad thing was most of my plays went off except for the one time I spent up at quarterback, Tom Brady. He let me down. I was shocked. I thought it was a must play for Brady and tournaments considering he was priced $1,000 more than everyone else, and the Jets came out hot. And New England just failed to keep up as far as fantasy points. They still came away with the win, but man, I could have been in for such a monster game if Brady had anything more than just 17 disappointing fantasy points.
Right. If you think your quarterback pick was bad, though, when you hear about my week, so I wrote up 3 quarterbacks: Deshaun Watson, Carson Palmer, and then was on the fence with my third. I liked Kirk Cousins a lot. I thought he'd be low owned. Josh McCown was the guy who I was originally on early in the week, and our listeners know that. And then the third guy was Kevin Hogan. Ultimately, I settled on Kevin Hogan, and I went out Saturday night when I should have been setting my lineups. And then Sunday morning, I had an article due at noon. I had to do my redraft lineups, my rankings, and time was running out. So I didn't have time to set all of my DFS lineups. I had about $700 in play. So I went 80% on Hogan, a guy I didn't like on this podcast a week ago and was super on the fence about anyway. And I had 80% exposure to him because I just had trouble working out the stacks for all the other guys. You know, there were a bunch of different guys to like. I liked John Brown a lot. I liked Larry Fitzgerald a lot, both in great spots. Somehow, despite all of this Hogan, I still made over $1,000, but it could have been such a monster day for me. Literally every wide receiver I wrote up had 10 plus targets or scored at least 18 fantasy points. Everyone but Julio and the other Hogan. I had 80% Saints D and Mark Ingram. All my running backs smashed. It was the most tilting and one of the most profitable days I've had in recent memory.
Yeah, that was quite the week between the Saints defense and the Texans defense. It's not often we see teams go off for 20 plus or 30 plus fantasy points from the defensive position. What do you say? Let's dive into the next week, though, week 7.
Let's do it. What quarterbacks are you on this week?
Man, it's tough. So we've got an interesting week. Thursday is a Kansas City-Oakland game. Sunday night is the Falcons-Patriots. Monday night is the Eagles-Redskins. So I really like those 3 games, and it's tough playing the main slate on DraftKings because of it. So I'm going to be doing a lot of Thursday through Monday games, and I think a way for me to find savings is paying down at quarterback. And the guy I'm probably going to be doing it with is Tyrod Taylor. He's $5,100. The Bills are coming off their bye, and they're taking on a banged-up Jameis Winston, who's currently suffering from an AC joint sprain. The Bucs defense is banged up as well. Levante David, Noah Spence, TJ Ward, and Keith Tandy, they were all limited in practice today. Tampa Bay has allowed the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks to start the year. Every single one of their opponents has scored at least 16 DraftKings points, which is great for Tyrod at 5,100. That's easily eclipsing his 3x cash game value. Tyrod at home has had some crazy splits as well. He's averaging 18.8 DraftKings points at home versus just 11 on the road. And we're seeing, I don't know, teams off buys are more focused. They're coming in with a better game plan. And considering the state of the Buccaneers defense, I think Tyrod's a safe play for cash.
Yeah, right. I'm with you. They're allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game over expectation. They rank second worst in PFF pass coverage grade. Uh, Another mobile type quarterback that I'm interested in this week is Dak Prescott. Did you know that he ranks second among all quarterbacks in fantasy points per game? That was kind of surprising to me. I figured it'd be Brady or Alex Smith, but no, it's Prescott. The 49ers don't look too bad in terms of fantasy production allowed, but they rank last in the league in PFF pass coverage grade. They easily have the worst cornerback core in the league. Blowout potential is a bit of a concern, so you're going to need plenty of Zeke Elliott as well. But I could see, I'm kind of on the fence with both guys. They're both cheap, but I both like pairing them with their quarterback in cash. But those are two guys I'm on. Another is Marcus Mariota. We should be a little bit concerned about the hamstring injury limiting him in terms of rushing production, something he's been quite reliant on over the past 2 seasons. But it's just a smash spot. The Browns are allowing 6.9 points to opposing quarterbacks over their fantasy expectation, which is ridiculous, easily the most. By expectation, they should be giving up 0.39 fantasy points per dropback, but instead they're giving up 0.59, which is it's so crazy. And they're pretty stout against the run. They rank third best in yards per carry allowed, but they rank last in the league in opposing passer rating.
I'm still a little concerned about that hamstring injury with Mariota. I don't know how much exposure I'm really trying to get there. It's a good play, though. I mean, we've seen the Browns give up fantasy points in bunches. Game that I'm looking at targeting just from both a cash and tournament perspective is these Eagles-Redskins game, as I alluded to earlier. I think both Carson Wentz and Kirk Cousins are in play. They're both priced pretty affordably, $6,700 for Wentz, $6,500 for Cousins. Carson Wentz threw for 307 yards and 2 touchdowns in Week 1 in their previous matchup against the Redskins. They're now playing as 4.5 home favorites, and only the Saints and the Patriots are implied to score more than Philadelphia this week. Washington is still without Josh Norman, and I really like how this game sets up for Alshon Jeffrey and Zach Ertz. Alshon is 4th in air yards among all wide receivers, and Ertz is 2nd among all tight ends. The two are combining for just shy of 50% of the team's target market share. When Wentz throws, he's thrown to these two guys, and he's thrown for 7 touchdowns over his last 2 games. I think he looks as sharp as anyone right now, and he has a high floor and a high ceiling in this one. On the other side of the ball, I think Cousins is also in a great spot. He's been stringing together some really quality fantasy outings over the last 3 weeks, throwing for multiple touchdowns in each game, averaging 27.4 DraftKings points in the process. Philadelphia's corners are still an area for us to target weekly, and I don't blame anyone who really wants to try and find ways to get Terrell Pryor back into their lineups. He's in the bargain bin now, just 5,300, but he'll be running routes against the guys that we continually to pick on this podcast, with Jalen Mills, who's currently our number 91 ranked cornerback, and Rasul Douglas, number 77. The Eagles' defense has allowed the most passing completions and attempts, with opponents throwing on them a league-leading 71.5% of the time. That's just absurd. And as such, they've allowed the 3rd most passing yards and 4th most fantasy points to opposing QBs. I'm going to be game stacking a lot here between Wentz, Cousins, and a lot of their weapons.
Right, completely agree. Both rank top 6 in fantasy points per game. This is the 2nd highest team total of the week. On defense, teams are passing against Philadelphia 72% of the time, which leads the league. But next closest is Washington with 64%. Definitely a smash spot with crazy shootout potential. And like you said, Cousins' top weapons match up especially well against the Eagles. Philadelphia is giving up the 2nd most fantasy points per game on short passes. That bodes well for Chris Thompson and Jamison Crowder. Pryor runs 44% of his routes from the left. That's where the Eagles are giving up the most fantasy points per game. And then same thing for Wentz. Like you said, Ertz and Jeffrey combined for 48% of the team's targets, 58% of the team's air yardage market share. Washington's allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game over expectation at tight ends, and they will be without Josh Norman. They rank 1st best in yards per carry allowed. Definitely shaping up to be a pass-heavy shootout with plenty of fantasy goodness. Another game like this that's unfortunately off of the main slate is Matt Ryan and Tom Brady, both of whom look like great fantasy options this week. Highest game total of the week by a landslide. Pats defense, we know, especially susceptible to really everyone and anyone at any position. They rank just behind the Browns in fantasy points per game allowed to quarterbacks over expectation. What are you thinking about that?
I love it as well. I just wish it were on the main slate. Every quarterback has hit the 300-yard mark against the Patriots this year. Matt Ryan and the Falcons just got embarrassed with that Dolphins comeback last week. Is angry Ryan a narrative? I mean, we've got angry Tom Brady. But I think the thing for the Falcons is double-digit targets to Julio Jones is imperative. Anything less, and Steve Sarkisian should be fired, to be honest. I don't know why he's not utilizing his best weapon. And he publicly acknowledged it earlier that he needs to get Julio the ball more. Like you said, this is the highest projected game of the week, and this is as sure a bet as any for a potential shootout. You can just game stack this one as well. I think we'd also be remiss if we didn't mention Drew Brees. At 7,600, he's a complete stud. Lock and load him against Green Bay secondary. He should be in for a massive game here as well.
Completely agree, and I still like Mark Ingram and potentially Saints defense this week.
Yeah, speaking of Mark Ingram, let's pivot over to the running back position.
Whoa, look at that segue.
In mid-season form, here we are, week 7. Okay, running backs. There are some very good running backs priced up at the top that are in good positions for us to use for cash games. The cheap punts are very risky this week. There's no Jerick McKinnon. There's no Mark Ingram. There's no Alvin Kamara for us to spend very low on and get away with it. As such, it's kind of hard for cash game construction. I'm kind of looking up at just paying for 2 studs, possibly a third in the flex. And the guy that I really want is Zeke at 9K. While Le'Veon is a favorite target of mine in GPPs, I'm probably going to be leaning on Zeke in cash. Pat Thorman's Snap, Pace, and Stats weekly segment has this game highlighted as one that should see a major uptick in volume. The 49ers are allowing an NFL high 70.8 snaps per game, and opposing running backs are taking advantage of it. The 49ers have allowed the 3rd most rushing attempts against and the most running back receptions allowed. Zeke can take advantage of both. Outside of that weird Week 2 Denver game, Zeke has averaged 24 carries per game and 4 targets per game. Dallas is currently a 5.5-point road favorite, running against the San Francisco defense that recently lost starters Arik Armstead, who has a broken hand, he's now in IR, and Navarro Bowman, who was cut. Zeke should be a no-brainer this week in a game Dallas should have continuous positive game script, as you alluded to earlier, Scott.
Right, and let's not forget how bad the 49ers were against running backs last season. They gave up more fantasy points per game allowed to RB1s, just the lead running back on each team, than Ezekiel Elliott averaged last season. That's ridiculous. Granted, they are giving up far more to receiving running backs this season, but like you said, there should be plenty of positive game script, and Zeke definitely could be running wild. Going back to the other cash game consideration stacking option, LaShawn McCoy ranks first among all players in expected fantasy point market share. What does that mean? That just basically means like all fantasy points are being funneled through McCoy. It's just not a lot because the Bills aren't this super prolific offense. He also ranks 6th among all players in expected fantasy points per game. Tampa Bay is kind of a tough matchup. They rank 10th best in yards per carry allowed, but McCoy should get a serious volume boost if Jameis Winston sits out, and I like pairing him with Buffalo's defense if that's the case.
I agree with you. Do you think it's going too far to stack Tyrod, Shady, and Bills defense in cash games? Is that a feasible option?
Yeah, I think that's a fine option, but there actually are, believe it or not, even more compelling Buffalo plays there, which might have me on Dak Prescott and Zeke, although I like Dez too. I don't know. We'll have to talk it over, but I think that is viable.
Yeah, and the thing with McCoy is, like, he's still scoring so many fantasy points, and that's, like, without him scoring a touchdown. He's getting just a ton of fantasy points through the receiving game, and there aren't many targets for Tyrod to target here. I wouldn't be shocked if Shady had maybe 8 plus, 8 to 10 targets. That seems very feasible considering Jordan Matthews is probably questionable for this game. I think he's got the rushing and receiving upside that could warrant a cash game lock. I don't know, man. I'm trying to think of who else I'd like to lock in, and at 7K, Melvin Gordon is pretty appealing. After watching Orleans Darkwell run all over the Broncos defense, I'm pretty comfortable playing Gordon here, given his price tag. He's been a fantasy monster to begin the year, averaging 21.2 touches per game, scoring 7 times in 6 games. He's seen 20 targets over the last 2 weeks, which is just crazy for me. Only 5 running backs have forced more missed tackles than Gordon so far to start the year. Denver has yet to allow a rushing touchdown, but a lot of that is likely due to the team preventing offenses from reaching the red zone. They've allowed a league-low 2.0 red zone trips per game. However, the Chargers are 2-point road favorites in this one, which lends itself to believe that the Chargers should be up in this game, and it could be a tight scoring game where I'm wagering that this TD streak by the Broncos comes to an end and Gordon finally punches one in.
Gordon finally punches one in?
The Broncos finally allow one to be punched in.
Oh, right.
Let me rephrase.
Right. Yeah, I want to see how contrarian that is before I jump on board. But I get what you're saying. He looks matchup proof, given all of his work as a receiver, and Denver ranks first best in fantasy points allowed to running back. So could be a sneaky play for sure. Another sneaky play with, I think, is James White. So we know how Atlanta is so susceptible to receiving running backs. This season they're giving up the 5th most receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Last year they gave up the most. We know what happened the last time James White played Atlanta: 16 targets, 14 receptions, 130 yards, 3 touchdowns, in what should have been an Super Bowl MVP winning performance. Gillislee played in a demoted role following his fumble last week, and I haven't heard anyone talk about it yet.
Oh man, you're almost bearing the lead here. My bold take saved for the end of the show was Dion Lewis. I think he has a chance to go ham here. To be honest, it could be White or Lewis, and it's more of me just taking a stand here. Lewis has forced 11 missed tackles on 30 rush attempts so far. That's just absurd. He's run a pass route under nearly 50% of his snaps, spending half his time as a receiving back when he's not evading tacklers as a rusher. His snaps have gone up 4 consecutive weeks. His touches have gone up 4 consecutive weeks. And I think James White is going to be the popular play. But Lewis had the same number of snaps as White last week and out-touched him 11-7. I'm going to be a little bit more contrarian here, taking the Lewis over White. But I think that's more of like a primetime slate play versus anything you want to try to do on the full slate of games.
Right. All right. So maybe that wasn't sneaky at all. But what about this one, who fits a similar mold to James White, and that's Christian McCaffrey.
Now we're talking.
I feel like he's undervalued, just in relation to how he's talked about. He's constantly knocked for 2.7 yards per carry, 4.3 carries per game. But that doesn't really matter to me in full PPR sites, especially. We've seen guys like Theo Riddick last season, Danny Woodhead in 2015, really finish top 8 in fantasy points per game, despite seeing single-digit carry totals per game. He ranks 13th among running backs in fantasy points per game, but his volume has been fantastic. He ranks 8th in expected fantasy points per game, basically even with Leonard Fournette. He ranks 17th among all players in expected receiving fantasy points per game. So that's like wide receiver numbers. Yes, his efficiency has been poor, but he gets set to face off a Chicago defense missing starting linebackers Jarrell Freeman, Nick Kwiatkowski, and John Tamu. I butchered all of those names, but I could see him being a pretty solid contrarian play this week.
Now you're getting better at pronouncing those linebackers week after week because we keep targeting them with the receiving running backs, and I think it's a great play. Monday Night Football rolls around, my normal routine is to look over my fantasy squad, see who I've got playing, and then figure out the upcoming week. I'm trying to look at immediate values and start a cash game lineup from there. And Christian McCaffrey was in my first iteration, so I'm completely on board there. I like the thought process. Speaking of rookie running backs, there's a couple of really cheap ones that are pretty interesting this week. I like Joe Mixon at 5K. He's more of a tournament option than anything, but it's kind of interesting seeing what they'll do against the Steelers. They're coming off the bye, so I kind of want some exposure there. Alvin Kamara at 5,600 is also interesting. We saw the Saints benefit from massive positive game script last week. We're not entirely sure how this could go with Green Bay. I'm very on the fence about whether or not I think the Saints are going to blow out the Packers or not. They're on the road in Green Bay, so I'm not 100% on board. And there's like a story you could tell where Brett Hundley just starts taking off and making plays happen. The Saints get down. They've historically struggled. There's some significant home road splits with Drew Brees. I don't know how much of that's noise or not, but if they were to get down, it seems like another play for Alvin Kamara. He's priced pretty high at 5,600 though, which is one knock against him. But he's their receiving back, and he could be used plenty in that game. If I'm looking for a punt though, a guy that's been drawing my interest and finding his way into some of my lineups is Marlon Mack. He's only $4,100. I think he could see an expanded role this week. We just saw that Robert Turbin is injured now. It's likely leaving a lot more snaps for Mack to take. And he just looks completely different when you see Frank Gore take a carry and then Marlon Mack. Mack just looks like a breath of fresh air, while Gore looks like he's running in quicksand. I think Mack is a sneaky play as well at 4,100.
Right, good point. I don't think people realize it, but Turbin's actually served a really valuable role for fantasy. He's averaging 5.4 expected fantasy points per game. He's seen 11 targets and 23 carries this season, with plenty of valuable looks near the end zone. So Marlon Mack definitely could be a beneficiary with him out. Another rookie running back, though, is Leonard Fournette. Colts defense is allowing the fourth most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I've been getting hammered on Twitter, though, just because I've been talking about how his two longest runs and his only two runs over 20 yards have accounted for 37% of his total yards on just 1.5% of his carries, and I don't think that's sustainable. You could look at someone like Kareem Hunt, who has seven carries of 20 or more yards, and he's in play as well, especially, I mean, he's always in play, but especially if Charkandrick West, who is dealing with a concussion, is not ready to return for Thursday's game. He should see a much larger workload as a receiver. Another guy I haven't heard much about, but then again, I don't really listen to too many podcasts, is Jordan Howard. He saw 36 rushing attempts in Week 6. That's the seventh most by any running back this past decade. Chicago is really taking it easy on their rookie quarterback while leaning heavy on their running backs. Since Mitch Trubisky was named the team starter, the team has passed on only 32.7% of their offensive plays. I think that would be a season-long record dating back to like 1938. But when Mike Glennon was the starter, they passed on 57.5% of their offensive plays. And he gets a sneaky good matchup this week with Luke Kuechly out. Man, these linebackers have tough names. With Kuechly out. So over the past 3 seasons, 29 games with Kuechly, 21.1 fantasy points per game, 9.5 rushing fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. Without Kuechly, 26.6 fantasy points per game and 13.9 rushing fantasy points per game. That's a significant difference. So I like Howard seeing the volume in a matchup that looks better than many suspect.
Yeah, on the onset, that's not a matchup that I'm really targeting, but I do like those stats there, especially with seeing how much volume that Howard got last week. Do you want to pivot over to wide receiver, or are there any other running backs you're looking at?
There's a few more. Adrian Peterson really looked amazing last week. He's still probably too cheap. The Rams rank 11th best in opposing passer rating, but 27th best in yards per carry allowed. They're allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. We talked about last week how Wade Phillips' defenses sell out to stop the pass at the expense of the run, so he is kind of interesting, although games in London typically gross me out. C.J. Anderson, he's in a really great spot. Chargers are giving up the second most yards per carry, the third most rushing fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. It's just quintessential GPP play, though. 3 games with 20 or more carries, 2 under 10. He had 0 targets last week, while Jamal had 3. Undoubtedly risky. I might go back to the well on Jay Ajayi. The Jets are allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. 51 carries and 6 targets in the last 2 weeks. Miami's favored by 3.5 at home. The Ajayi's averaged 3.5 fantasy points per game more at home over the last 2 seasons. Ajayi disappointed in the same matchup a few weeks ago, but he was dealing with a knee injury. And then, of course, you got to talk about Jerick McKinnon. Over the last 2 weeks, he leads in snaps 91 to 55, carries 32 to 27, targets 12 to 3, carries inside the 10-yard line, which is the most surprising, 2 to 1. Ravens have been a sev against the run, but they're getting Brandon Williams back, and he's a significant difference maker, but he's still certainly in play. Let's segue back over to the wide receivers, and who jumps out to you, Tyler?
Honestly, I think it's a week where all 3 of the top priced wide receivers are worth getting some exposure to. Antonio Brown, Julio Jones, AJ Green. If I had to pick one of them, I'm probably going to go with the cheapest of that bunch, AJ Green. He's a road warrior, as his career splits have shown, but he's been even more impressive when playing against the Steelers. Over his last 5 games against them, he's averaging 24.7 DraftKings points and over 118 yards per contest. He should run most of his routes against Joe Hayden. Hayden is allowing a 67% catch rate on the year, and Green has put up some big games against him historically. Green's averaging double-digit targets on the year and could be in for a monster game here, given their projected negative game script as 5-point road dogs. Julio is another guy that I'm super interested in. Like I mentioned earlier with Ryan, I think I'd be shocked if Julio comes away from this game without double-digit targets. And anytime you see a guy like that getting that kind of volume, he's like a must-play. You need some exposure in tournaments. Antonio Brown as well. We saw last week that juggling catch at the end of the Chiefs game. Anytime he's targeted, he can make something happen. There's no reason why you shouldn't have some exposure to Antonio Brown in any given week. The guy has 30-point upside, and honestly, I think all 3 of these wide receivers are in okay enough matchups where you want to target them this week. None of them are fades.
AJ Green worries me a little bit. Pittsburgh ranks best in fantasy points per game allowed to opposing wide receivers. He only had 38 yards against them last season, the last time he played, but he did average 27.4 fantasy points per game against them in his previous 4 matchups against the Steelers. Antonio Brown would be an absolute must-play if Adam Jones sits. He sat out of practice yesterday, but he practiced in a limited fashion today. Make sure you monitor that. You left out my guy, though, Tyler. Dez Bryant, man.
I was leaving him for you. That's
why you're the best. Look at that chemistry. I've ranted about this all year, all offseason, every single week. He is the single most cornerback sensitive wide receiver in the league on both a per route and per target basis. He's had the single toughest cornerback schedule, seeing a league-leading 59% of his targets against cornerbacks who graded out among our top 25 a season ago. But he ranks first in targets inside the 10-yard line per game, first in end zone targets per game, 8th in targets per game. And guess what? It's the easiest cornerback schedule you can get. San Francisco's starting cornerbacks Dante Johnson, Rashard Robinson, Quan Williams all rank among our 20 worst graded. Really all the wide receivers on Dallas have a strong matchup. Jason Witten does not against Jaquiski Tart. But I'm absolutely in love with Dez Bryant. I'm going to keep hammering these splits until I don't know, the end of the until Armageddon. Adam Thielen and Jarvis Landry are both obvious plays again if Parker or Diggs sits. Parker, even if he does play, has a tough draw against Morris Claiborne. Let's see if there's any more obvious plays. Pierre Garcon, Dallas is allowing the second most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers. He has 30 targets over his last 3 games. And then after that, it's a bunch of sneaky plays, but there are a lot of them. Tyler, you want to bring up a few?
Let me just hit one more obvious play, I think. It's Michael Thomas, 7,500. Demarius Randall and Devon House are two of our worst graded corners. Randall ranking 108, House ranking 91. I think a lot of people are upset with Michael Thomas' performance last week, given the Saints' massive shootout and how little fantasy production he got. I think he's a great tournament option. I think he's a great cash option, to be honest, but I think he's a great tournament option where I think we'll see some tilted owners fade him. As far as other values, I'll go on the other side of the ball in this game. Randall Cobb.
Great call, by the way. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. I think Randall Cobb's a great option going against Kenny Vaccaro. He's been absolutely dreadful to start the year covering the slot. He's allowing a 71% catch rate and ranks as our 83rd ranked safety. That's out of 83 total with a 34.8 grade. That 34.8 grade, if translated over to the cornerback page, is our second to last worst cornerback. He's not faring well in coverage whatsoever, and he would have ranked 114 out of 115 qualifying cornerbacks. There's a bit of risk here playing Cobb. We're seeing Hundley take over, and we're not really sure of the any of the rapport he's going to have with his receivers, but given the low ADOT, high percentage throws that Cobb runs, I think he has probably the safest floor of any of Hundley's receivers, and he's probably going to be the one that I'm going to target the most in this game that projects to be a shootout. There's also a lot of really sneaky value plays. Eric Decker at 4,300. The Titans should be in a great spot here, and I'm going to be avoiding Jason McCourty, who we have shadowing Rashard Matthews. I'm not sure how much time he'll spend shadowing, but either way, Decker will avoid his coverage. Instead, I'll be looking at Decker, and he's coming off an impressive 7-catch, 88 yards, where he saw a season-high 9 targets. He'll be running most of his routes against Jamar Taylor, who's allowing a 73% catch rate and 2.13 yards per route covered. That's the third worst rate so far this year. I think there's just some really solid savings you can get with Decker at 4,300 and a guy that has a pretty safe floor. Are there any other values you're looking at, Scott?
Yeah, really, there's a bunch. Jordan Matthews if he plays, Brandon Tate if he does not. Tate will run. He ran 24 of his 26 routes from the slot last week. Tampa Bay is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers with 22.6. That's most by 4.6. Overwhelming, really. Sterling Shepard, he returned to practice on Wednesday. The Giants obviously have a depleted receiving core. He averaged 6.8 targets per game prior to his injury. Seattle's allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers, which ranks second as a percentage of their total wide receiver fantasy points allowed. Danny Amendola, Atlanta's allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers after allowing the 3rd most last year. He's had between 5 and 8 targets in every game he's played. Mohamed Sanu, another slot wide receiver to like. If we assume New England sells out to stop Julio Jones, should see a target increase. He's back at practice. The Pats are giving up the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. Robert Woods, Arizona's allowing the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers lined up to their quarterback's right, which is where Woods runs 57% of his routes. It's one of the highest rates in the league. He's seen 7, 6, 8, 7 targets in his last 4 games. Patrick Peterson, we know, should shut down Sammy Watkins, though Kupp is in a decent, pretty good spot as well. I have a few more names on my list. Do you have anyone else you wanted to talk up?
No, I just wanted to double down on that Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp call. I think the Cardinals' passing attack, the way to attack them is avoiding Patrick Peterson and just heading that left side. Justin Bethel and the slot with Tyrann Mathieu been struggling since coming back from injury. Honestly, you hit all of my value plays, so I'm kind of at an end. I'll let you take over if you have anyone else.
Well, you touched on this one already, but Terrell Pryor, he looks like one of this season's biggest fantasy busts in redraft leagues, but the guy we talk about every single week, he might as well be a wide receiver because he ranks 3rd among wide receivers in targets. Jalen Mills, does he cure all? He has in pretty much every matchup so far. Terrell Pryor runs 44% of his routes lined up to the left, and the Eagles are allowing the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers lined up to the left. Devin Funchess, Really, him and Kelvin Benjamin are about even for me in terms of my rankings, but Chicago's allowing the third most fantasy points per game to wide receivers lined up to the right, which is where Funchess runs 46% of his routes. And then finally, Tyler, it's Bennie Fowler chalk week.
Oh, that's true. We've got Emmanuel Sanders likely out.
Definitely out.
It's gonna narrow that field of targets for Trevor Siemian. Demarius Thomas is a great play at 5,800. Bennie Fowler is an even more tremendous play at 3,300. We've seen that Thomas and Sanders have routinely accrued 50% of those targets in that offense. I think good 25% of those could go to Fowler this week, who should be in line for 7+ targets.
Right. So Sanders leaves behind about 14.5 expected fantasy points per game. Sanders played on just 62% of the snaps last week, which led to season high expected fantasy point totals for both Demarius Thomas, 24.1, and Fowler, 18.3. Thomas draws the much tougher matchup in shadow coverage against Casey Hayward, but really the Chargers have been stout everywhere on the perimeter, but very weak in the slot where Fowler runs 77.4% of his routes, and that shouldn't change with Sanders out. The Chargers are allowing 16.3 fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers, which ranks third most. I'll take the segue here, though, Tyler.
All you.
So I've talked since like week one. I've mentioned how I'm terrible at tight end rankings, and if you look on Fantasy Pros, which measures the accuracy of each ranker, I'm like top 10 in running backs, top 10 in wide receivers, top 25 in quarterbacks, and then I'm like 89th in tight ends. So I wasn't BSing you. I am not good at tight ends, but I made a point to spend a lot of time and effort on tight ends, and I have 6 guys written up here. But Tyler, I'll let you get the first crack.
Okay, well, if you're giving me the first crack, I'm starting at the top with Gronk. Okay, last week, he was finally cleared from the injury report, and we saw what a healthy Gronkowski can do, seeing 10 targets, hauling in 6 of them for 83 yards and 2 scores. The Jets played the Patriots pretty close last week, and Vegas is projecting another close one here between Atlanta and New England. This is the week's highest scoring game of the week at 55 points. Julius Thomas was held in check by Atlanta last week, but the Falcons did allow a 5-catch, 122 stat line to Charles Clay the week before. Gronk scoring a touchdown and hitting the century mark, and that 3-point DK bonus won't shock me at all given the game's high projected team total. Gronk leads all tight ends and targets inside the 20, inside the 10, and he's always a matchup nightmare. I think he's a smash play, 7,300. I'm still paying up for it. Go.
I mean, I like it, absolutely. But really, to me, there's just so much cheap value. And I know you'll have a good stat on this one, but George Kittle has totaled 17.4 and 17.0 expected fantasy points over the last 2 weeks. That ranks 10th most among all players over this stretch. During that span, he's seen 17 targets, 2 deep targets, 4 of his team's 6 targets inside the 5-yard line, and 2 of his team's 4 end zone targets. And he's paired. He gets his college quarterback back. What's your stat for me, Tyler?
Oh yeah, Kittle scored 10 of CJ Beathard's 34 total passing touchdowns during their final 2 years at Iowa. That's 29%. Basically, one of every 3 passing touchdowns that Beathard threw was going towards Kittle. I love this play for Kittle. 3,600. He's a great cash game play at that price. He ranks 5th among all tight ends in routes run this year, running a route on 60% of his snaps. That's well above the average we normally expect from our fantasy tight ends. In fact, only 4 tight ends eclipsed that 60% rate out of the top 40 fantasy relevant tight ends from 2016. Like you said, man, 17 targets the last 2 weeks. That's pretty good quality for a tight end. I'll look again at the upper echelon with Zach Ertz, 6,900. He's averaging a nice, robust 8.75 targets per game. Ertz is always in play, and he's probably the main reason why I want to play this Thursday through Monday slate. Ertz lit up the Redskins in week 1, scoring 17.3 DraftKings points, catching 8 of 8 for 93 yards. I love Ertz, to be honest. I'm probably going to find ways to do 2 stacks of tight ends. And instead of trying to get one of those risky upper mid-priced wide receivers, I'll probably lean towards Ertz instead as a flex play.
I'm with you. Like we said earlier, definitely another smash spot for Ertz. I like Alshon Jeffrey as well. Another cheap guy we can look at is Jack Doyle. Since Jacoby Brissett's first start, which is week 2, Doyle is averaging 12.2 expected fantasy points per game. That would rank 4th most among tight ends. It would even push him above T.Y. Hilton for the team lead. He draws an at-worst neutral matchup against Jacksonville this week. They are allowing the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends over expectation, and he is egregiously priced on DraftKings as the 20th most expensive tight end on the site. Another guy I am all over is Kyle Rudolph. He's seen 9 targets in each of his last 2 games, perhaps coinciding with the Dalvin Cook injury and shift to pass-catching threat Jerick McKinnon as the primary back. He's averaged 25. He averaged 25.5 routes run per game with Cook active, 33 routes run per game in his last 2 weeks. Pass blocked on 20.3% of his passing snaps to 8.3 the last 2 weeks. He is up against. And he averaged, I think it was 3.7 targets per game in his first 4 weeks, 9 targets per game in his last 2 weeks. He's up against a Ravens defense which is giving up the 2nd most fantasy points per game over expectation. What does that mean? It means based on the average fantasy points scored of their opponents, they're giving up way more than that. So they really haven't faced too many teams that utilize their tight end to a high degree, but they're still giving up a ton of production in spite of that. I have a few more names. Anyone else from you, Tyler?
Oh, that's just some great information there. But one guy I'm also looking into is ASJ. He's now priced at 5K. We all know that was a touchdown last week. He scored that. He still was able to hang up an impressive 8-catch, 46-yard, and we'll say 1, but it was really 2 touchdowns stat line. And he has now seen 19 targets over the last 2 weeks. He's no longer a screaming value given his price, but he's Josh McCown's most reliable weapon, leading all Jets in red zone targets despite being suspended the first 2 games. The Dolphins have given up 7 catch games already to both Austin Hooper and Hunter Henry. Pace should be down in this game, so ASJ is really like the only guy I really want in this Dolphins-Jets game. But I did like your stat though on Jay Ajayi. I think he's seen 25 and 26 carries the last 2 weeks. I think he's a sneaky tournament play that could go overlooked. But let's stay on topic here with tight ends. Who else do you have for us here?
Great call on ASJ again, referencing that points against over expectation. Miami's allowing the 5th most. And he actually ranks 3rd among tight ends, ahead of Travis Kelce in expected fantasy points per game. I do think he's actually still kind of a smashing value, but there's a lot of strong value plays this week. Another is Nick O'Leary. So Charles Clay drew 3 targets on 13 snaps last week and still leads all tight ends in expected receiving fantasy point market share. Really insane usage near the end zone for Clay. But O'Leary saw 6 targets last week following Clay's injury, and he is minimum priced on FanDuel. Though, to be fair, Tampa Bay has been far more susceptible to tight ends. And then finally, as a tournament play, Delanie Walker. So he's up against the Cleveland Browns defense that surrendered the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends last year and rank worst among all teams against expectation this year. The Titans have the 5th highest implied team total. Yes, he's averaging 44 yards per game, gross, 0 touchdowns all season, but he did see 8 targets last week, and I don't think too many people. Actually, no, he'll probably be highly owned. Kickers defense. Do we want to waste our time with that, Tyler?
No, I'm just going to go over the Bills defense again. I think they're a great play with Tyrod and Shady. Jameis Winston's going through that AC joint injury that we talked about earlier, that we're not sure if he's playing or not. Vegas isn't sure right now. They still have yet to release the lines. But Buffalo has scored 8, 14, 8, and 10 points. Steady production there. I think they're a great sound play for cash games. That's the only one I wanted to mention. Do you have any defenses you're targeting?
Uh, yeah, Bills, Saints. I don't know. I honestly haven't put too much thought into it, and I really don't until later in the week. But yeah, sorry, sorry, listeners. Um, but yeah, I think that's it. I am sorry to disappoint again, man. I just keep letting you guys down, but I am not much of a hot take artist. I just put out my takes, and then eventually someone will tell me whether or not it's bold. I'm sort of oblivious to all of that. But I know you've got some hot takes for me. You already said the Dion Lewis one. Do you have another one for me, Tyler?
I do, and I'm gonna first apologize for my bold takes being terrible last week. Oakland's wide receiver two, Amari Cooper, once again did squat, and Buck Allen. Well,
You sure
well,
he's the
Buck
wide
Allen.
receiver too? I think there
Oh
I
yeah,
think there are three or four Oakland wide receivers who have more total yards than him at this point.
I would not be shocked at all.
CPAT is CPAT the wide receiver too on Denver? I mean Oakland.
He should be Seth Roberts. I'm not sure.
Right.
And Buck Allen, I thought he would have gone
Oh
ham
yeah, me
this
too.
week. I had over 70% exposure to him. He was my most owned person, tied with Mark Ingram and the Saints defense. Luckily, the other two were able to make it a good week for me. But um, tell you what, though, I'm going to go back and double dip here. I'm going back to Amari Cooper once again Thursday night against Terrence Mitchell, one of the worst cornerbacks we've graded. Amari runs 83% of his routes from the outside. Terrence Mitchell just mans one side, with him manning one side, Marcus Peters on the other. Anytime Amari lines up on Mitchell, I think he has a chance to score. Mitchell is allowing the most receiving yards so far this year with 503, and he's allowing the most yards per route covered. I think this is a primetime game for Amari to go off. Nobody's interested in him. They've been burned repeat a week now. I think if he were to do it, it'd be this week.
That is spicy, and I'd expect no less from you, Tyler. Uh, why don't you tell the folks at home where they can find you on Twitter and get some more of your spicy hot takes?
Sure, you can follow me on Twitter at Tyler Buecher, Buecher.
And I am Scott Barrett. You can follow me on Twitter at ScottBarrettDFB. I have my Start Sit article coming out, and I have my advanced matchups play for Roto Grinders. What else do you have on the docket, Tyler?
I've got my cash and GPP plays for DraftKings coming out on Friday, and Saturday I have our Fantasy 5, doing a quick hitter around news around the league, and an advanced wide receiver cornerback matchup for our friends at FanVice.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you all next week.